The whisper before the penthy sun had barely risen over Beverly Hills, and already the city buzzed with quiet luxury. Fresh coffee steamed in penthouse kitchens. Tinted windows rolled silently through clean streets. Phones vibrated with updates, from agents, lawyers, and personal assistants. In the middle of all that noise, Keanu Reeves stood barefoot on the balcony of his modest home, holding a mug of tea. He had never been drawn to noise, never needed a mansion filled with people. He liked stillness, quiet mornings, soft light. But that day, the stillness would not last. Keanu was preparing for the biggest deal of his career. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't a TV show. It was something more personal. A global production company backed by new investors had offered him a position on their founding board. It promised creative freedom, global outreach, and a $100 million stake. In a new studio focused on uplifting stories, minority filmmakers, and ethical production models, everything. Aligned with his values, the contract had been months in the making. His lawyers reviewed it, his manager said it looked clean, and, that morning, was scheduled to sign. He arrived at the Sunset Marquis Hotel where the signing would take place. The executives had rented out the entire rooftop lounge. Everything was polished. Silver trays, imported water. Assistants walking quietly with tablets and contracts. Keanu walked in wearing a simple black t-shirt and jeans. No entourage. No noise. He was led to a private table near the edge of the rooftop. The city below stretched like a canvas. At the table sat three men, Brent Calderon, Silas Yuen, Derek Moss, the so-called ethical billionaires. They smiled too much. Brent leaned in. "Keanu, my man, it's all here. This is history." Silas added, "Your name will be on a studio that rewrites Hollywood." Derek smiled quietly. Just a signature away. The contract sat thick and heavy in a leather folder. Keanu flipped through the pages slowly. Line after line of clauses, terms, and promises. He had already read it days ago. His team had said it was safe, but something in him paused. A silence in his chest. He glanced around, and that's when he saw her across the rooftop. Dressed in a crisp hotel uniform was a maid. She was black, middle-aged, and moved with the quiet rhythm of someone used to being invisible. She was setting a tray on a side table, but her eyes kept darting toward the contract. She looked nervous, almost afraid. Keanu noticed in their eyes. Met, just for a second, she looked away quickly, but her hand trembled as she adjusted a glass. Something was wrong. He stood up, walked over. The executives behind him laughed lightly. "He's always curious," Silas said. Keanu reached the maid and spoke softly. "Hi, is something bothering you?" She looked startled, then shook her head quickly. "No, sir, sorry." But her hands were still shaking. He lowered his voice. "You?" Looked at the contract. "Did you notice something?" She glanced around. The rooftop was too open. She whispered without moving her lips. "That's the wrong contract." Keanu's breath caught. "What do you mean?" he asked, eyes steady. "It's not the original one," she whispered. Pages were switched. Heart pounded. "How do you know?" She looked down. "I cleaned their office. I saw the draft last night." They were laughing. Said you'd never notice. Keanu froze. He turned slowly back toward the table. The three executives were watching, trying to look relaxed. Too relaxed. He walked back, opened the folder again, and flipped to a specific clause, one he remembered clearly from the original version. The wording had changed. Instead of full creative control, the contract now gave the board the right to override key decisions without his consent. His name was still there, but his voice had been stripped. He closed the folder quietly. Brent chuckled. "Something wrong?" Keanu smiled gently. "Just realized. I need to read this again." Silas's eyes narrowed. "Your lawyers already cleared it?" Keanu shrugged. "And now, I want to clear it too." He picked up the folder and walked away without another word. As he reached the elevator, he turned back to look for the maid, but she was gone. Hours later, Keanu sat at his kitchen table. The Contract spread out in front of him. His lawyer sat across from him, pale and speechless. They slipped in 5 changes, the lawyer said. None of them small. Keanu leaned back, and if I'd signed it, they would have had full ownership. Of my name in connection to the studio? They would have used you to raise billions, the lawyer said, and control the message, Keanu whispered. He remembered the maid, the whisper, the fear in her eyes. He had no idea who she was, but she had risked everything to speak up. He called. The hotel asked for her, but no one by that name was on the staff list. The floor manager said, "We had a temp from an agency that day, but she didn't show up for her next shift. Do you have her name?" A pause. I think it was ... Grace. Grace Monroe. Keanu hung up, then made a decision. He would find her not just to thank her, but to understand why she helped him. Because in a world where most people stay quiet, a whisper like hers could only come from something deeper and what he didn't know. Yet, was that Grace wasn't just a maid. She had a story, a past, and secrets that connected far deeper into this scam than anyone realized. And as he began searching for her, others were searching too, but not to thank her, to silence her. Asterisk, the woman no one noticed said next morning. Keanu Reeves sat at a cluttered wooden desk with a steaming mug of black tea in one hand and a spiral notebook open in front of him. He wasn't writing movie lines. He was writing clues. 2 names circled in red. Ink. Grace Monroe, the Valentine Studios Dell, had spent the entire night reviewing the altered contract. 5 clauses had been changed. 3 of them would have transferred power. 2 of them hinted at something darker rights, to modify creative work without permission and to profit from secondary global sales using his brand without notification. His lawyer said it was the most sophisticated legal baton-switch he had seen in 20 years. They did this like they've done it before, told Keanu, and probably to someone who didn't have a Grace. Keanu replied, but finding Grace wasn't easy. The hotel had no employee records under her name. The cleaning agency said no one named Grace Monroe had worked that day. Are you sure she was a staff member? They asked. She wore the uniform. Keanu said, maybe someone sent her, or maybe, he whispered, she sent herself. He started making calls, used no assistance, no media. He visited the rooftop again, asked the security guard for footage. They said it had been erased. Accidentally during a system reset? Coincidence? The guard said Keanu didn't believe in those anymore. He walked the streets near the hotel, asked, is the cafe down the block? Ever seen this woman? He asked, showing a sketch an artist friend had helped him draw from memory, a young barista. Squinted. Maybe, yeah. She comes in sometimes, sits in the corner, drinks tea, always has a notebook. When did you last see her? A few days ago. She left fast, like she was late. Keanu leaned in. Did she say anything? She said. I did something I wasn't supposed to, but I had to. Keanu's heart stopped. Do you know where she went? The barista shook her head. She left this behind. She handed him a folded piece of paper. On it, in tight handwriting, was a quote, "Some people wait for justice. Others become it quietly." Beneath it, G.M. Keanu walked out of the cafe and stood on the sidewalk, holding the note. Grace wasn't just a maid. She was running from something, or toward something, meanwhile. Across town in a sleek office tower, the 3 executives, Brent Calderon, Silas Yuen, and Derek Ma, sat in a tense meeting he didn't sign. Brent hissed. Silas slammed a hand on the table. How did he know? Derek leaned back. Someone warned him. Who? Brent demanded. Someone who shouldn't have been there, Derek replied. That maid. They fell silent. Find her, Brent said. Dan makes sure she stays. Quiet Grace, at that moment, was sitting in a borrowed room above an old bookstore in Inglewood. Her hands trembled slightly as she packed a worn backpack. Inside it was a flash drive and a notebook. She stared at a photograph of herself, younger, standing beside a different version of Brent Calderon before he wore tailored suits before. The money, before everything broke. Grace had once worked for his mother. She had raised him like a second son, and then she had discovered something years ago. A scam, a plan, to steal her employer's money before she passed away. Grace tried to speak, but no one believed the maid. That's when she vanished. She changed her name, moved cities, and waited. Waited for the day Brent would try it again this time. With someone bigger, someone the world would actually listen to. When she saw Keanu's name tied to Valentine's Studios, she knew, and she stepped out of the shadows back at Keanu's home. His phone buzzed. A blocked number. He answered. A voice whispered, "You're not supposed to be asking questions." He didn't respond. The voice said again, "You don't want to be the next name buried under silence. Drop it." Click. Call ended. Keanu stared at the phone, then dialed his lawyer. "We need to go public." The lawyer paused. "With what? Everything?" A day later, a quiet blog post appeared online under an anonymous author. The title read, "How a Hollywood Scam Nearly Stole a Man's Legacy." The story was detailed, careful. It never named Keanu, but it listed the tricks, the forged clauses, the fake contracts, and a single phrase at the end. A black maid whispered the truth before the lie became law. The post went viral. People debated. Some called it fake. Others remembered stories they had heard about similar studio takeovers. But the truth had been planted in Grace. She saw it on a library computer, and she smiled. For the first time in years, but danger was getting closer. Brent had traced. A private investigator spotted her near Inglewood. He sent the address. Brent's message was short. Deal with her now. No, but someone else was on the way to Keanu. Had finally tracked down an address from a social services file using the name Grace. Monroe. She had once volunteered at a community kitchen. The address matched the back of the bookstore. He drove there without security. No manager, no press. Just him. He parked the bike outside, climbed the stairs, and knocked. The door opened slowly. Grace stood in the doorway. Her eyes widened. "You came," she said. "You saved me." He replied. She stepped aside, and KeanuReeves walked into the story behind the whisper. The story no one ever saw coming. Asterisk, the woman behind the whisper, Grace Monroe, stood in the doorway, shoulders tense, eyes tired. She had not seen someone look at her the way KeanuReeves just did in a long time. Not like she was a problem, not like she was invisible, but like she mattered. "You came alone?" she asked. Keanu nodded. "I trust you." She looked away, as if those 3 words carried more weight than she could hold. "You shouldn't," she whispered. "Not after what I've done." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "You saved me from signing away my voice. I think that counts for something." Grace stepped aside, allowing him in. He entered a small, quiet room filled with the scent of old paper and tea. There were stacks of notebooks, folders, and a small corkboard covered in clippings. Names, strings, and hand-drawn maps. It didn't look like the home of a maid. It looked like the headquarters of someone who had been watching and waiting. Keanu sat on the edge of the chair. Grace sat across from him, nervously tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I've followed Brent Calderon for almost 10 years, she said softly. "The world knows him as a tech investor, a film producer, a philanthropist. But I know him as something else." Keanu leaned forward. "What?" Grace's voice tightened. "A con artist in a suit." She pulled out a dusty folder from a drawer and placed it on the table. This is why I risked whispering the truth to you." Keanu opened the folder. Inside were dozens of documents. Contracts, reports, statements from other victims, some anonymous, some with names scratched out for safety. Every case followed the same pattern. Brent and his team would approach someone with credibility. They'd build trust, pitch a noble idea, art, technology, health, education. They'd bring on real experts, then slowly swap out the details. Change the contracts, reroute the ownership, leave the face of the project holding the failure while they took the profits. They do it quietly, Grace said. They erase things. Footage, files, people. Keanu felt a cold weight settle in his chest. How did you find all this? He asked. Grace looked down. Because I was the maid who overheard them planning their very first scam, she said. They laughed about it. Didn't think I understood the words. But I wrote them down. I never forgot. She paused. I've been collecting everything since. But no one would listen. No lawyer, no journalist, no one. She met his eyes again. Until you. Keanu sat in silence. Then said, they erased the security footage from the hotel. They knew you warned me. Grace nodded slowly. They'll come for me. Then you're not staying here tonight, Keanu said, already pulling out his phone. I'll keep you safe. Grace reached out, placing her hand on his arm. No, she said quietly. If I keep hiding, they win. Meanwhile, across the city, Brent Calderon sat in a silent room lit only by the glow of his tablet screen. He read the blog post again. Every word. A maid whispered the truth. He closed the device slowly. She's alive, he said. Silas Yuen, seated nearby, spoke carefully. What if Reeves is helping her? Brent didn't answer right away. Then he smiled a sharp, dangerous smile. Then let's make him look. Like the fraud? 2 days later, headlines appeared online. Keanu Reeves accused of backing false Maid conspiracy and billion-dollar deal gone wrong, Maid claims dismissed by legal experts, no evidence found. Who's really behind this story? News anchors debated, some mocked, others speculated. No one had clear facts, but someone was pushing the narrative hard. Grace watched it unfold from Keanu's guest house, her temporary safe place. They're flipping the story. Shh, she whispered. Keanu stood beside her, arms crossed. Then we flip it back. He called his lawyer, his tech contacts, and the handful of people in the industry who still believed in doing the right thing. One of them, a quiet editor named Celia, who had once worked for a security firm, called him back. I heard about what happened, she said, and I have something you need to see. An hour later, she arrived at Keanu's place with a thumb drive. I used to freelance for the hotel's camera systems, she said. I kept a few encrypted backups when I left, just in case. She handed him the drive. This was the original rooftop footage. From the day of the contract signing, Keanu plugged it into his laptop. The screen lit up. There it was, him walking to the table, the executives smiling, the maid in the background, and then clear as day. Grace whispering something, Keanu pausing, turning, and walking away. Celia smiled. This is your truth. It's not just mine, Keanu said. It's hers. He looked at Grace, whose eyes were wet with disbelief. For the first time in years, she was visible on screen, in truth and unstoppable. Keanu called his lawyer. Get ready, he said. We're going public. The next day, a press release appeared from Keanu's team. Not flashy, not loud, just facts. A video, a timeline, a statement from Grace, and a message. This is about more than a contract. It's about the people you never see, the voices you ignore, the truths you try to bury. The internet exploded. Hashtags trended. #IBELIEVE Grace. #The Maid, who said no. #Keanu knows interview requests poured in. But Grace declined them all. Except one. A quiet podcast run by a former social worker. On the recording, her voice was steady. I didn't save Keanu Reeves. I reminded him he didn't need saving. He needed truth. And now, so do all of us. Meanwhile, Brent Calderon received a subpoena. Silas Yuen's laptop was seized. Derek Moss disappeared from the country. The walls were closing in. Not because of headlines, but because of one whisper from a woman the world never saw coming. The truth they tried to bury, the world was watching now, for the first time in years. People weren't just clicking for gossip or box office numbers. They were watching a quiet storm unfold, a storm started by a whisper, contract, and a woman no one had cared to notice. Grace Monroe, the black maid with no title, no law degree, and no platform, only her voice, her memory, and her courage. Keanu Reeves sat across from Grace at his kitchen table. Outside, reporters were camped on the sidewalk, drones hovering above the neighborhood. "I can't go outside without cameras following me," he said with a small smile. Grace looked down at the mug in her hands. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "You didn't ask for it," Keanu replied. "You earned it." Grace shook her head. "I just wanted to stop them from doing it again, not all this." Keanu leaned in. "Sometimes the world needs to look at what it's ignored for too long, and sometimes that means the cameras have to point in the right direction for once." Meanwhile, across town, Brent Calderon sat in a tall glass building with his lawyers. The footage had gone public. The press was calling it the most blatant corporate deception in Hollywood history. Contracts were being examined. Victims were coming forward, but Brent still wasn't afraid. "We spin it," he said coldly. "Say she was paid. Say he's doing it for attention. Smear them." "There's a problem," his head lawyer said. "We've received a court notice. Full investigation, and the files Grace kept. They're being verified." Brent's jaw tightened. How did she keep them hidden this long? She trusted no one. Keanu knew they would try to destroy Grace's credibility, so he acted fast. He arranged for her to have pro bono legal support, a security detail, and a media specialist to protect her privacy. But most of all, he gave her something no one ever had before: his presence. He stood beside her not as a savior, but as an equal. When Grace appeared for her first closed-door testimony with investigators, Keanu walked her to the courthouse himself. He didn't wear a suit. He wore jeans and his old black hoodie. Reporters shouted questions. He said nothing, just placed a hand on Grace's shoulder and guided her through the doors, inside. Grace opened her notebook, the same one she'd used for years. It was full of names, dates, overheard conversations, copied contracts, even photos of destroyed evidence. She spoke clearly, softly, but with a strength that made even the sternest officials pause by the end of the session. One investigator, an older woman with years of fraud cases behind her, stood and said, "This is the most organized file I've seen from a civilian." Grace didn't smile. She just said, "I spent years being ignored, so I took notes." Outside the courthouse, a woman approached Keanu. She was in her late 60s, hair gray, eyes tired. "Are you with her?" she asked. "I am," he said. The woman reached into her purse and handed him a worn envelope. "He ruined my son," she said. "Brent Calderon. 5 years ago, promised him a role in his company. Stole his work. Blacklisted him, my son. He didn't make it." Keanu took the envelope gently. "What's your name?" "Mrs. Hayes. We'll fight for him, too." Nodded once and walked away. Back in Grace's temporary apartment, a letter had arrived. An official offer from a film production company. They wanted to buy the rights to her story. Grace stared at it, stunned. "They want to turn it into a movie." Keanu chuckled softly. "It's Hollywood. They turn everything into a movie." She shook her head. "I'm not a character." "You're a lesson," he said, "and lessons are powerful." But Grace didn't sign. "Not yet. They don't get to own this," she said. "Not again." Instead, she began speaking at small community events, libraries, churches. She told her story in her own words. No cameras, no spotlight, just folding chairs, tea and truth. And one day, a young girl raised her hand and asked, "Are you a lawyer?" Grace smiled. "No, I'm just someone who paid attention." The girl said, "I want to do that too." Grace bent down, took the girl's hand, and said, "Then you're already braver than most." Across the world, online forums lit up. People began posting stories of assistants, janitors, interns, people who had caught fraud but were silenced. They used the hashtag #EBEGrace, and in the middle of it all, Keanu never made it about himself. He declined interviews. He refused awards. He even turned down a front-page magazine cover. "This isn't about me," he said. It's about how close the truth was to being erased because it wore a maid's uniform. But Brent wasn't finished. He hired new lawyers, tried to delay the investigation, and worst of all, he tracked down someone from Grace's past. Someone she had never spoken about. Someone who could be used against her. One evening, Keanu returned, home to find Grace sitting quietly on the porch. Her face was pale. She was holding a photo. It was her years ago, standing with a man in handcuffs. "This is my brother," she said. "He got into trouble, real trouble. And when the news of me started spreading, someone sent this photo to a journalist. They're trying to use his past to destroy mine." Keanu sat beside her. "Truth can't be erased," he said softly. "Especially not yours." Grace looked at him, eyes wet, "But it can be twisted." He shook his head. "Not if you own it." The next day, Grace stood in front of a crowd at a youth center. Reporters had shown up uninvited. She looked at them and held up the photo. "Yes," she said. "This is my brother. He made mistakes. He paid for them. I stood by him, because I know what it feels like to be alone." She paused. "But I also know what it feels like to speak when your voice shakes, to risk everything for a whisper." Her voice rose. "I'm not perfect, but I told the truth. And if that truth makes you uncomfortable, maybe you've been listening to the wrong stories." The crowd stood, not with applause, but with respect. And the reporters, they wrote a very different article. In the coming weeks, Brent Calderon's empire began to crumble. Investors pulled out, emails leaked, lawsuits mounted. Derek Moss was arrested in Switzerland. Silas UN disappeared from social media entirely. And Grace, she finally sat down, breathed, and smiled. Not because the battle was over, but because her story had finally begun. Asterisk. The trial they never saw coming's courthouse stood tall against the pale morning sky. Inside, the air was heavy with whispers and waiting. Security was tight. Media vans lined the streets. A sea of camera flashes lit up the front steps like lightning. Today wasn't just a hearing. It was a reckoning. The state of California had officially brought criminal fraud charges against Brent Calderon, Silas UN, and Derek Moss for conspiracy to defraud, attempted intellectual theft, coordinated legal deception based on evidence provided by one woman, a woman who had once been invisible. Grace Monroe. She walked up the courthouse steps, quietly wearing a simple navy blue dress and carrying her notebook. Not a designer bag, not a prepared statement. Just that same tattered spiral with pages full of truth. Keanu Reeves walked beside her. He wore no sunglasses, no stylists, just a black suit wrinkled at the sleeves. He opened the door for her. She looked at him and whispered, "Are you ready?" Replied, "No, but we're not alone anymore." Inside the courtroom, Brent Calderon sat between two high-priced attorneys. His jaw clenched, his suit perfect. Scanned the room and smirked when he saw Grace. He leaned toward Silas and whispered, "They're going to trip. Wait for it." But Grace didn't trip. She took the stand with steady feet. The prosecutor, a woman with silver streaks in her hair and a voice sharp as glass, began her questioning. "Please state your name for the court, Grace Monroe. What was your profession?" "I worked as a hotel maid. But before that, I was a private housekeeper. I cleaned offices, delivered mail, made coffee. People forgot I was in the room." "And what did you witness?" Grace opened her notebook. Her voice was low, but her words struck like thunder. She described Brent's early scams. The coded language, the clean folder and switch folder system they used for contracts, how she had seen him and his partners laugh about their targets, how they used legal tricks to strip ownership and blame failure on others. "I wasn't supposed to understand," Grace said. She explained how she had copied notes, saved documents, and passed on details to victims anonymously even. "Though none of them ever knew. I wasn't brave enough to go public before," she admitted. The courtroom was silent. But when I saw Keanu Reeves at that rooftop table, I knew they were doing it again. And this time, couldn't stay. Silent. The defense tried to shake her. "Miss Monroe, isn't it true you have a brother with a criminal record?" "Yes. And isn't it true you once lived under a false name?" Yes, so why should we believe anything you say? Grace looked straight at the jury. Because truth doesn't need a clean past to be real, and lies don't need dirt to grow. Even the judge paused. Then came Keanu's turn. He took the stand. The courtroom leaned forward. Mr. Reeves began, "Why did you trust her?" Keanu looked toward Grace, because she didn't ask for anything in return. Because her eyes didn't flinch when she told me something I didn't want to believe. He spoke of the altered contract, the erased footage, the way Brent smiled. Too much, in the way Grace whispered just loud enough to save him. "I've read 1,000 scripts," he said. But that moment her whisper was the most honest line I've ever heard. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered with signs. Some read, "I believe Grace." Others read, "Truth has no uniform." Some people came because of Keanu, but they stayed because of what Grace represented. A quiet woman who stood against a machine as the trial continued. More victims came forward. A young indie filmmaker, a nonprofit worker, a retired teacher who had invested her pension. All had been manipulated. By Brent's team, all had signed contracts. They didn't understand until it was too late, and all had remained silent until Grace. The defense scrambled. They tried blaming Silas. Silas tried blaming Brent. Brent tried blaming miscommunication. But the jury wasn't buying it, not this time. Because Grace had made them feel something contracts never do. Truth. On the final day of testimony, the prosecutor turned to the jury and said, "This is not just a case about fraud. It's about arrogance. It's about powerful men who counted on silence." But one woman, one maid with a notebook broke that silence. "Oh, and now it's your turn." When the verdict came in, the world held its breath, guilty on all counts. Brent Calderon was sentenced to 15 years. Silas UN received 10. Derek Moss, who had already fled the country, was declared a fugitive. His international warrants were issued. The courtroom erupted. Not in chaos, but in quiet tears. Grace sat with her hands folded, breathing deeply. Keanu placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said. She shook her head. "We did." In the weeks that followed, Grace received letters from across the world, from maids, interns, nurses, janitors, young people, old people, people who had once been too afraid to speak. Each letter ended with the same word, "Thank you." But Grace wasn't chasing headlines. She turned down every major TV interview, refused book deals instead. She started a foundation, the Quiet Truth Initiative. It helped whistleblowers, offered legal support, and trained everyday workers to recognize contract fraud, coercion, and silence culture. She didn't do it for fame. She did it so no one would ever have to whisper in fear again. And Keanu. He became the initiative's first donor, not with cameras, not with fanfare, just a simple check and a handwritten note for the woman who saw what no one else did and said what no one else would. The world kept spinning. New headlines came. But in a small corner of Los Angeles, one truth remained. A woman once called just the Maid had saved more than a contract. She had saved people with one whisper and an unstoppable heart. The whisper that changed the world. Grace Monroe stood at the edge of a quiet stage, tucked inside a modest community hall in Oakland. She wasn't wearing designer clothes. Her hair was simply tied back. In her hand was the same spiral notebook that had once lived in her cleaning car, its corners frayed, pages full of handwritten truths. The room was full of people. Some wore suits, others wore aprons. Some had calloused hands from working night shifts. Others had trembling hands from holding in secrets for too long. They had all come for her, not to celebrate her fame, but to thank her for her courage. She stepped up to the microphone, cleared her throat, and began. "I was never trained to speak in public," she said. "I was trained to clean up after people who didn't notice me." The room stayed quiet, but that gave me something more powerful than a degree. It gave me the ability to hear what wasn't meant to be heard, to see what people tried to hide, and to carry those pieces of truth, even when I didn't know what to do with them yet. Her voice didn't shake. because now she knew what to do. Across the country, the Quiet Truth Initiative had grown into something larger than Grace ever imagined. It wasn't just about fraud anymore. It's about dignity. It was about restoring the voices of those pushed into corners, janitors, assistants, nurses, interns, maids, dumb, drivers, people who held systems together, yet were treated like shadows in Washington. The Senate had taken notice. A bill was being proposed, the Monroe Act, a national legal protection for workplace whistleblowers at all levels. Regardless of position or rank, it was being called the most important accountability law since the 2000s. When they asked Grace to speak before the committee, she gave only one condition: I won't stand alone. So Keanu walked beside her. So did Lisa, the young woman Grace had mentored. So did Raphael, the former janitor, who now ran a learning center for immigrant workers. So did 20 others, people whose voices had once trembled, but no longer. The moment Grace walked into the Senate chamber, cameras flashed, reporters whispered, but she didn't care. She opened her notebook, flipped to the first page, and read the words she had written the night after the rooftop contract. Incident: I don't want to be the one who knew and did nothing. Even if I lose everything, I want to be the one who whispered anyway. By the time she finished her testimony, senators were silent, not out of politics, but respect. When she left the chamber, one young aide ran after her. Miss Monroe, he said, breathless, I'm studying law, and I want to do it the way you taught me. Grace smiled. Then you're already ahead of most. Meanwhile, Brent Calderon was serving his sentence. His private island had been sold. His assets frozen. His name erased from business schools that once used him as a case study for success. Ironically, the only place his name remained was in one line from a training manual under Grace's foundation, a reminder of what happens when we ignore the silent voices around us. Keanu never took credit. When asked about the case in an interview, he simply said, She saved me. She saved a lot of people. All she asked for was to be heard. Grace received letters every week, not from celebrities, but from single moms. Warehouse workers got cashiers. Double quotes. I stood up today. I didn't whisper this time. I spoke. On the 1-year anniversary of the verdict, Grace returned to the rooftop, where it all began. It was quiet. The city below moved on like it always did. She sat at the same table. A waitress approached, smiling. Can I get you anything, ma'am? Grace paused, then said, Just tea. The waitress nodded and walked away. A few minutes later, a familiar figure stepped out of the elevator. Keanu holding 2 cups. He placed one in front of her. Double quotes. I thought you'd come, said. She smiled. You always know. They sat together, in silence for a while, just watching the city. Then Keanu said, Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't spoken that day? Grace looked at him. No, she said. I think about how many times before that I didn't. And then she reached into her bag, pulled out a fresh notebook, unmarked, clean. She placed it on the table. It's for the next person who needs to write down the truth. Keanu looked at her. You think they'll use it? Grace smiled gently. If they do, maybe they'll start by whispering. But one day, they'll speak loud enough for the whole world to listen. The sky turned gold above them. The city lights began to blink on, one by one. But for once, it wasn't the skyline that felt powerful. It was the woman at the table. The one who had once whispered and changed everything.